I'm going to start with just speaking to one slide, even though you'll see all four, saving that program because they're just usually too large. So what we're talking about here are four predominant worldviews. You more than likely share aspects of each one of them. They're very important philosophically to try to understand where people are coming from and hopefully helping you discern where you're coming from when you hear something. In those classes where we did the exercise in how do you hold your world together, where you examined your own personal, family, social, cultural, and mythic stories, this type of worldview analysis will also help you understand your own development. The pre-modern, which is not a negative word, but I rather use the word classical, is in the metaphysics, or its understanding of reality, is that there's a nature and a supernature. And that predominantly the supernatural is the more powerful and informs and controls the natural world. It's epistemology, or how do you know things? It's based upon both mystical faith and an active faith. Here you normally have a holy text such as a Bible or Quran, some type of scroll or writings that you feel are, many people, that they are the actual words of a God. So when you want to know something about the world, that's where you go first. You don't go to reason, you go basically to the supernatural revealed text. The normal view of human nature in this regard, especially here in the biblical West, is that we are born into sin. We are dependent beings, depending upon God. Basically, there's nothing on earth that we can trust to give us true knowledge. A lot of it is just temptation. In one sense, the goal of life is to die in a state of grace and go to heaven. Life on earth is transitory and of not much consequence, even though God did create the world because of sin, until it is the second coming and the deliverance of the new earth and the new heaven. Things are pretty tough. We're in a vale of tears, so to speak. Ethically, everybody has duties because, again, if you look at this, the politics in just a broad sense of how people organize power, politics in that sense, it's a very hierarchical. Usually in our culture, that for a long time it was feudal, where we have kings, which we still have in some countries, and we only lost the kings in 1787 when they cut off the head of the French king, which was very symbolic and also issued in what we will talk about next, called the modern era. This is a very authoritarian structure. It's top down. You have popes, you have cardinals, you have bishops, you have presidents, you have kings, you have people, and there's a real hierarchy. The philosophy is called idealism because, as opposed to realism, is again that the real world, what you think is the real world, is actually illusionary. In Plato's perspective and Socrates, it's a world of shadows. And you have to wake up to the fact that what is ever changing, which is the world you live in, is not the real world. There's an ideal world of forms, of perfection, of oneness. This is very much the Greek philosophy that's going to have a heavy influence on the formation of Christian doctrine. What we have with the modern era, which is technically going to begin about 1500 and last into the 20th century, basically up to the end of World War II or the 1960s. The metaphysics, or the understanding of the world, is that reason, not revelation, reason has the pride of place, and pride is the right word because human beings become pride of their capabilities to know and master the world. They master it not through dominion given them by God, but through their own cleverness and their ability to understand reality. This is built on, evolved out of the classical worldview. Aristotle was a realist and placed, as many of the Greeks did, a tremendous emphasis upon the mind and the function of reason. How they know the world, the epistemology, is naturalism. They're very interested in nature, and in the theological world, again, following upon the value that's placed on reason. There's a movement called faith-seeking understanding. Now, this is what separates Protestants from Roman Catholics, is if you're in the sola scriptura, or scripture only, reason really can't deliver much. In the Roman Catholic tradition, it was a belief that God gave us reason. We could find our way to understand God. It's called natural theology, and there's an embrace of reason. This movement is eventually going to give rise to modern science. They looked at human beings. They saw a tabula rasa, or a blank slate. There was no original sin. Individuals could act for good or for evil, and there's a lot of emphasis upon personal effort and your obligation and duty to do things in the world. There's the right to pursue happiness as opposed to living on a veil of tears. You're to enjoy the natural world. It gives rise to romanticisms and movements that where people are indulging themselves in the joys of the world. Politically, there's a focus on liberty of the individuals. You're not bound to class, and all are equal under the law. As it gives rise eventually to an understanding of democracy. It's going to replace the hierarchical order of kings. Again, this is a philosophy in general that's called realism because it looks at the real world in front of you and says that's the world you know through your senses, and that's all you can know. And but it's a safe world to well, we have here in the Enlightenment era, which again starts basically in the 1700s, is not only reason, but a move towards empirical science and a much headier understanding of what human beings can accomplish. We're eventually going to be in a period that you should be familiar with where people feel that human beings are perfectible. A lot of things that go behind our formation of America as a democracy was grounded in the fact that people felt that human beings could actually build basically a perfect society. And one of the reasons they called this the New World as opposed to the Old World, which was Europe. And this is manifested especially in the East Coast with all the New Havens, New Jersey, New York. Everything is new in the Americas. And one of the biggest new things was that our Constitution opens with this phrase, "we the people." Like, well, who are we the people? They've never appeared before in human history. There's only been kings who have the divine right from God to rule. And how are you? What's this "we the people"? Well, there's this belief in not only the individual but also in the group that we can create basically a virtuous and good society, and that God has shifted from becoming a God of vengeance to a God of benevolence. And even in a word that's called deism, where basically God is very removed from the world, is sort of, as one image of the times is, the world is like a wound-up clock that's put on the mantle, and then God goes away because the clock is going to run by itself. These are the laws of nature, God's laws of nature, but human beings are the ones who take the lead here. This is a wild embrace of science, not a cautious one. Technology enables us to manipulate the world. We've even created a prison system that was supposed to reform and make human beings whole. It shifted away from seeing crime as sin to seeing it as an offense against society, but they believe that people could be reformable. It's a concept that's sort of come and gone in our society, but it's there. In many ways, our social institutions were like the machines we created. The steam engine and everything else gave us confidence that we could create ways of controlling the world. There's a liberalism, there's the I who should be free to think, especially in religion, which was very controversial. Separation of the church and the state, which of course had never been done before. All groups, why we call it Roman Catholicism, and Lutheranism is the religion of state religion of Germany, and you have Calvin in Switzerland, things like that. Now this is a separation, a very unusual thing, but a confidence that they could have a separation and have a society that's not dependent upon the church. You determine your own faith, you're a free agent. This also led to the search for the rights for all people, slowly the anti-slavery movement and women's rights. Even capitalism was seen as something that enabled the individual in their Horatio Alger worldview of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and getting a place in society, creating of the middle class. The belief in progress, ever forward motion, things are always going to get better. When evolution comes in, evolution in one sense confirms this idea of progress and sort of an unstoppable movement for things to get better. In a sense, there's no problem that cannot be solved. The real sort of everyday acceptance of science can solve every problem. You get everything from phrenology, which was feeling the skull to be able to predict human behavior, to the development of vaccination and understanding of germs. People's health improves, they start living longer lives, we get more stuff. that we're basically very optimistic, and we're liberal in this sort of classic sense of open-endedness and acceptance of to go out and change and build the world. So very heady. Now, postmodernism is not exactly a really defined movement, and it's the world that we live in today. But how it arose is the fact of in the 1940s, with the early part of the 20th century, we had two world wars, and they were wars to end all wars, which didn't happen. And it ended up with our dropping a weapon of mass destruction upon ourselves called the atomic bomb, and coming to recognize some deep evils inside the human soul, such as what happened in the concentration camps with the burning and mass murder of Jewish and other people who didn't fit into the Nazi worldview. This gave people a tremendous amount of skepticism, the ability to hear somebody say something and then go, what's your purpose? What's your ulterior motive? And what are your assumptions? And so it's basically looking at all ways of explaining reality as narrative. Science is a narrative, art is a narrative, capitalism is a narrative, biblical stories a narrative, and understanding whether or not now you fit into that narrative or not. And one of the dominant things is the understanding that the controlling narrative that has come down from the classical through the modern through the Enlightenment is a narrative basically of the biblical West that gave rise to science and secular worldviews, but has been basically run by white males and propertied white males. Not there was always a property restriction. Even in early America, there was a property requirement for voting. So there was just real questioning about, is this system fit me? And so obviously this is a perspective that's looked at by people who have been on the underside of society, who have been oppressed. And they look at all these other previous philosophies as basically self-congratulatory self-deceptions, okay? They listen to the Christians tell their story, and they just sort of say, yeah, well, right, okay, so you've got somebody rising from the dead, and you're just deceiving yourself. And, you think, did Jesus come to save women? Did he just come to save men? There's all these questions. They look for hidden agendas. There's no truth from God or science. Truth is what you make out of your life. There may be some objective, empirical truths, but basically what truth is for the human being is what you create. Again, it's given rise to different things, a liberation philosophy and liberation theology, which basically says that if you want to understand the world, instead of looking at these people whose narratives have created all the problems, have now put us on the brink of nuclear destruction, are basically destroying our environment, have us consuming more things than we need to eat, ravaging the earth, drugging ourselves up, imprisoning all types of people in our culture. They see all those negatives. They want to be liberated from that. And some find that liberation in theism, and some find it in an atheism. There's endless war where everyone is a terrorist, and the individual experience of women, minorities, and other people is they don't fit in. And there's not only crony capitalism, there's no true capitalism, it's all influence and the 1% and the Occupy Wall Street insights. And the fact is that everything's militarized. The whole world is militarized. It's all this, everyone's a terrorist. You go to the airport, what happens? You're a terrorist, and then you go tomorrow and you're considered a terrorist again. Will it ever stop? So there's a certain environmental, some people it's the negative determinism. There's a guy we read about, an anarchistic philosopher named Derek Jensen, who says civilization is the problem. Civilization cannot solve the problem. It created the problem. It is itself the problem, and we have to bring down civilization. What does that mean? Wow, that's a tough one, right? But there's something there to think about. There's all types of philosophical movements that have come out of this, behaviorism, determinism, existentialism, neo-Marxism, whatever you can, there's everybody, but they see themselves as having a narrative, and we all live by narratives. Again, if we did the how do you hold your world together exercise, and if you're in your class, and you understand that I've asked you to look at how it is that you've learned the stories, the narratives that make you who you think you are. And what would you have to do to change? How would you have to change the narrative to come up with being a different person. So postmodernism is in sort of a hodgepodge collection of these different perspectives, but since everybody's skeptical of one another and understands there's narratives, there's not like some mass identifiable movement where this person is the postmodernist philosopher, as you would say. There's Aristotle and Plato and classical Greek. You look at Thomas Aquinas as a major medieval theologian or whatever like that. So, but we live in this postmodern era, and we really have to deal with this philosophy. So.